Here's what we're going to cover in our session today. We're going to take a look at why we use radios. A lot of folks say, why aren't we just on phones? They do everything. What radio networks are, these are different than broadcast networks. How to form an effective message, what to say when you're on the radio starts before you push the button on the radio. It's a very important concept, and it makes it a lot easier. We're going to talk about general radio operation and a number of ways to get the radio to operate the best, to get the best signal and the best range, for example. Radios operate without infrastructure. We know the dreaded cell phone towers that go down, whether there's power outage or whether there's an earthquake that knock these things out of alignment and they don't work. We know they run on replaceable batteries, which is better than a rechargeable battery in this case, because you get an instant recharge in the second or two it takes you to put new batteries in. That's a big advantage over the time it takes you to charge a phone, no matter how fast your phone charges. And we can communicate to many people at once. Radios are naturally broadcast. Where phones can be used to talk to groups, it's a little tortured, to be honest. So in general, these are the main ways. And then at the bottom of the screen there, you see one other way that's not so much technical as it is human. And that is the fact that our ears multitask better than our eyes. If you're communicating on a phone, you tend to be using a visual app much of the time. That takes your eyes away, and your eyes can only do one thing at a time. Whereas when you're using radios, your ears can be monitoring what's happening on the radio while your eyes, hands, and your brain are engaged in something else, helping somebody, let's say. So there's a big advantage in using a pure audio device than a phone that tends to always want to drag you toward using a visual messaging interface. So 4 really strong reasons here to make it clear why we use so-called old-fashioned radios, because they are excellent at what we do. The radios we use are called General Mobile Radio Service, GMRS. You may have already purchased and used what are called FRS, Family Radio Service radios, commonly used when a family goes on a trip to Disneyland and they're in a couple of cars and they want to stay in touch as they go down I-5. Very common. The ones we use, the GMRS on the left, are similar. They're very similar to FRS in terms of the kinds of technology built into the radio. But as you'll see on the bottom of the screen, they do several things better. They are more capable because they're allowed by the FCC to use significantly more transmit power, so you can get out and reach someone better. They're allowed to have better or changeable antennas in some cases. Some radios allow that. The handheld radio we use doesn't, but that's okay because its built-in antenna works very well. And they can use what are called repeaters that we're not going to dive into tonight, but those can be used on mountaintops to allow radios to reach far better range as well. We typically don't use those currently around Marin and the NRGs, but they're available to us and something we might use in the future. You might encounter them in different parts. So these are 3 big advantages of GMRS over FRS, but they're very similar. And the GMRS radio you use for NRG also can talk to all the FRS radios out there in the world. So that's an important thing to know. You're getting kind of 2 radios in one when you buy a GMRS radio, and that's why they're a little more expensive than the very cheap FRS radios you may have seen. This is the radio that we tend to use and we ask everyone to use. It's called the Midland GXT 1000. We have no sweetheart deal with Midland. No one's getting paid a bonus or a bounty on getting you to buy one of these. We do this because these have been long tested all around the Marin County groups to be exceedingly good radios at a very reasonable price. You can buy cheaper radios, but we don't believe you can buy a better value radio for what we need from it, the performance it has, the features it offers, and what we think is a pretty good price. It allows us to use the full power that is available within GMRS. It runs on 4 AA's. Other radios that are smaller and more compact may only run on 3 batteries, and they may often be AA's, which means you have far less power in terms of duration of runtime, and you often have less voltage, which allows the radio, or means the radio, cannot create as much transmit power. So the idea of a slightly bulkier radio that has more bigger batteries is a good thing. If you're comparing radios and wondering why can't we use the smaller ones, because the battery restrictions on those are a very big deal to what we use. And the last reason we ask you all to use the same radio is so that trainings like this are uniform. We can tell everybody to do something on their radio one way, and it applies to everyone. We're not going to program radios tonight, but I do want to talk about one thing about programming them because it does create a lot of questions and confusion. And that is this idea of a sub-channel. If you look at this radio, you see the big numeral 1. That's the channel it's on, like a television or anything else. It's on channel 1. The little number in the bottom right-hand corner, in this case it's 02 or 2, same thing, is the sub-channel. This radio is technically on 2 channels. The sub-channel is a tone, you won't hear it, but other radios can hear it between themselves, and it allows them to create a handshake. The subchannel is essentially a filter that decides what other radios are allowed to be heard on the speaker of your radio. For example, radios that are on channel 1 will all be heard on each other's speaker, obviously. But a radio that's on channel 1 and subchannel 2 will only play the audio from another radio that's on subchannel 1 and subchannel 2. The radios will not play the audio from radios that are only on channel 1. They're filtered out. Now note, this is audio filtering, not true privacy. So here's another way to give you a visual of that, and then we'll be done with the subchannels. Let's say you've got a channel 1, the radios are on. You've got an NRG member who's out there in the field, a block captain, and you've got NRG control at wherever control is, and they're talking just fine. But then in that same neighborhood, you might have a bunch of neighbors who completely unknowingly are also talking on channel 1. They don't know what's going on. And we're all talking over each other because we're on the same channel and nothing separates these radios. So what we might do in a scenario is we might say, okay, NRGs, we're going to be on channel 1, but we're going to add a subchannel. And those two get sort of bonded together if you look at that circle there. That means we are now on channel 1.2, as we tend to call it. That's all. This is what it does. And you'll see now it has broken the red links to the neighbors. By adding a subchannel to our radios, we have in effect made them deaf to other nearby radios that are on the same main channel. So sending a message is the most important thing we're talking about tonight. What you say on the radio, not how the radio transmits and receives. Look at this chart I'm going to give you and try to make this part of your muscle memory. I know it's visual. Use this when you practice on your radio. You can easily do it practicing even with family and friends. You don't need to have a formal drill. The way you use a radio is as follows. And if you've got your radio handy, you can have it turned off, but still practice this in your hand. Push the push to talk button on the side. Wait 1 second. Talk. Wait a second. And then release the push to talk button. I don't want to belabor this. Let's do it again. Push the push to talk button. Wait a second. Speak what you have to say. Wait a second, and then release the button. This is the coin of the realm in terms of muscle memory on your radio. If you don't follow this sequence of push, wait, speak, wait, unrelease, you often will cut yourself off either at the beginning or the end of the message. And when that happens, someone's going to ask you to re-say it again. And if your habit is the same, you're going to do it again and cut yourself off. And we keep going around saying, can you do that again? Hold the button and wait. I can't tell you how often we have to issue that advice on the air during drills. So it's very important that you get this muscle memory down. Don't rush. Any profession where we have critical behavior, you'll hear the phrase, slow down to go faster. And this is an example of slow down to go faster. Don't rush and hit the button and start talking right away and then let go too soon. Because all you're going to do is have to say it again once or two more times, and now you've ended up taking more time than you thought you were saving by rushing. And then the next thing that happens after you do that, let's say you're calling from your block to control. The next thing that happens is everybody waits for 2 seconds. That lets another station jump in if they have an emergency. And then the party that you're calling is going to come back with their reply. Let's just leave that as a box. And then you're going to repeat again, waiting 2 seconds. Let anyone else come in who has an emergency. And then what do? You reply to the party you're talking to with the same sequence we've seen. So that blue bar in the middle, let's say that's control you're talking to. Everything else should be self-explanatory. It's kind of very repetitive here. Get into that rhythm and that muscle memory, and you'll have really easy communications in terms of no one ever having to ask, can you slow that down or say it again, or I missed a word. That'll become very rare. So now let's go a broader step. Let's look at a bunch of NRG units. These are all teams or block captains, if you will. And there's a medical team to throw in for a little variety. And they're spread all around various parts of Mill Valley. In the middle, here's your Mill Valley control, whatever it's called in your area. And at the control, the minimum you have is somebody on a radio and somebody on a notepad. It's about that simple. One's working the radio, one's writing everything down, the scribe. The scribe is as important as the radio operator, not less, not optional, just as important as the radio operator. They are a bonded pair, and they're always working together at the main trailer or wherever they may happen to be. Classic communication is like so. One radio at a time is talking back and forth with control, and they have the floor, if you will. This is classic Robert's Rules of Order, right? When they're done, then you might hear another station jump in and say, okay, now it's my turn to go back and forth relatively exclusively with control. This is very important because we don't have any visual cues to allow us to each see that we're trying to butt in. And so butting in becomes very messy unless you've got a dire emergency, which we're going to define in a few slides. That is your classic communication. One party at a time, talking to control, not multiple parties at a time, talking to control. Very important point. Now, there are a few exceptions I'm going to show you, but they're relatively rare. So let's say we were to go now to the content that goes into one of those classic message exchanges. Think clear and economical. There's no formula here, but think about clear economical messages. It's kind of like writing a news story. If you look back, if you've done any news writing or you wrote stories when you were in school, they taught you the who, what, why, when, where, right? Who are you reaching, calling, and who are you? This is the first thing you establish. You always start by saying, control, this is block 13. You don't say, this is block 13, control. You always start with who you're calling and then say who you are. That is the standard way to initiate a conversation. And then you wait to be acknowledged. They'll come back to you. Then you want to let them know some combination of, here's where I am, here's why I'm calling, here's what I want. This is very important. We all want to make sure that whenever we have a conversation, that there's a reason. You're asking for something. We're not doing idle chatter during NRG. And when do you need it? This is what control's looking for from you when you call in. Generally, these 4 things or some combination thereof. They don't all always apply. And then when you're delivering that message in those 4 bullets up there, say it no faster than someone can write it down. Because as we saw a couple slides ago, there is a scribe who's writing down everything you say, which is part of why we have the first line in this slide. Clear and economical. The fewest words possible to get across the message of the where, why, what, and when. This is really important because it's another way that you won't be asked, can you say it again and slow down? This is another one of those slow down to go faster things. So let's break this down a little bit, make it more specific. Here's a cluster on the left or a team. Here's Mill Valley Control. Here's how a typical conversation might go. And in normal times, we'd be together doing this on the radio, but this is just 2020. Mill Valley, this is team 1. Over. You always start with who you're calling, then who you are, and then wait. After a moment or two, you should hear back from Mill Valley Control. Team 1, this is Mill Valley. Notice they have flipped it. They're saying, who they're reaching, and then who they are. Always that order. Go ahead. Then you deliver your very economical, and we're going to practice this in a minute, your very economical message, where you are, what's going on, what you need. This doesn't say specifically when they need it, but you can tell from the message as soon as possible. This is relatively urgent. So it's all baked in there. Over, and you wait. And then you're going to get a confirmation back. And then the whole thing ends, again, with you saying, Mill Valley, team 1, Roger, out. We're going to define Roger and over and all that in a minute. Those are called pro words. So you'll understand those again in a moment. This is a classic exchange. It can go longer. It can have more ping pongs, if you will, more volleys of the tennis ball, so to speak, of that stuff in the middle. But you see how it starts, you see how it ends, and you see the stuff in the middle that is the payload. This is a classic exchange, economical, clean, and everyone knows exactly what the syntax is. So they know what they're hearing. Why this is important is because you've got people distracted in noisy environments on both ends during a real event. And so you want to make sure that their ear is hearing what their ear is expecting to hear in terms of the syntax, the semantics, and the format of it. That's why we make this so rigid and relatively similar. We're not trying to stifle creativity. This is not a time for creativity. This is a time when we're trying to be very efficient, obviously.
So how long do we wait? Let's say we do the transmission correctly. How long do we pause and wait before retransmitting?
Oh, good question. Normally, you'd wait. There's no rule of thumb. It'll depend on how busy things are. If you hear a very busy event going on, you'll know it may take longer. Rule of thumb, for example, ham radio operators who really do a lot of this kind of thing, they have a rule of thumb of 15 seconds to wait at the longest. And after that, you say, okay, something's going on. Either they didn't hear me on the radio or they have local interference. Local interference means there's someone talking to the operator. It's nothing to do with radio at all. Someone's leaning over the desk saying, I got to show you this. So use 15 seconds as a rough ballpark. That'll feel really long, but it goes by pretty quickly. So I mentioned some exceptions to our classic one party at a time. Here's some of those. So for example, you might say, okay, here's a medical team who's talking back and forth to Mill Valley. And everyone can hear that, of course, because we mentioned early on, radios are broadcast. They all talk to each other all the time, if they're in the same NRG, of course. So you see everyone's hearing at the same time. You always want to listen to those. You don't want to tune out any that, oh, that's not for me, and then just say, I can go on and stop listening. You never, ever stop listening. You always listen to your radio. The reason is there may be something said in there that is also of interest to you. Even though it's Med talking to Central, they may be referencing Team 4. And if Team 4 is listening, that means Team 4 will have also picked up the information by what we call intercept. Intercept just means I heard it too. That's all it means. It's not a fancy term for I was listening and I also caught that. So you may hear the control group say, after talking to Med team, say, oh, by the way, Team 4, did you catch that via intercept? And it's kind of your responsibility to have been listening to say, yes, I copy. They'll be sending supplies to me. Something like that. So that's just a big lesson to say, always be listening, because it's important to intercept information that relates to you, even if you're not part of that moment's specific combination of radios that are talking. Another example here is, why can't I talk from one radio to another? Why can't Team 3 just talk to Team 1? What's the problem with that? Because everything has to go through control or it becomes chaotic. But here's an example or an exception. We call it going direct. If you ask Mill Valley Central Control, there in the middle of the page, may I go direct with Team 1? They'll probably come back and say, yeah, Team 3, permission to go direct with Team 1. And then you, Team 1 and Team 3, talk back and forth for a moment, not too long, not more than a minute for sure. Say what you've got to say that's very specific to you two parties, and then you finish that conversation, and we go back to traditional operation of everyone going through network control. Here's one other mode. It's called relay. Let's say Team 2 is trying to reach the central, and they just can't get through. They're hitting a block. That red line there means they're just not getting through. And everyone else can hear they're not getting through. But Team 2 is just not able to make any connection to Mill Valley, so they're not getting a reply to your question. How long do you wait? Team 2 is waiting and waiting and waiting, and nothing's coming back. But perhaps the medical team is hearing all this go on and says, well, I can hear Team 2, and I know I can contact control, Mill Valley Central, so let me jump in and do what's called relay. Med team would say, Mill Valley, this is Med team. Med team, Mill Valley, go ahead. Team 2, forwarding on relay, they're trying to reach you with a request for blah, blah, blah. That's what relay is. You jump in and you become a middle person, a handoff. These are all relatively rare. Relay, direct, even intercept are relatively rare, but I wanted you to be familiar with these. This is not main modes of communication, but they are three things you should know, aside from the usual communication, which is one radio talking to central at one time. You never turn your volume down too much. I know it gets noisy. Sometimes these radios can sound kind of annoying. They're not high-fidelity devices. Radio's not meant for that, not these kind. But don't let ear fatigue make you go, I just need some quiet. Because when you do that, you're going to miss an important call. Happens every time. Keeping an ear on the radio, and if you can't, you hand it to your partner. We always deploy as more than one person, right? 2 or 3 of us at a time. If you're busy with your hands on someone helping them, you ask your partner, can you keep an ear on the radio while I do this? Or hand them the radio if there's only one, whatever it may be. And thirdly, when you're done, sign off, have to leave the scene, have to go tend to your own family or your own home, let someone know. Don't just leave, because at command, they have this mental picture of where all the resources are, that they've got someone at block this and block that, or NRG this and NRG that. And if there's suddenly a hole there, they're going to keep calling and calling and calling. And they'll have never known if you are out of range, injured, batteries are dead, or you just had to check out because you needed to go tend to something personal and you need to relieve yourself from the duty cycle. So these are 3 very important things that are just good housekeeping.
If we've checked our location and we're all secure and everything's been taken care of, would that be an appropriate time to ask permission to go directly to another team to see if they need any assistance in checking their?
That's logistics. That's more of a Maggie question than strictly a radio question.
Okay.
Right. Kate, so what you would do if your team, your block captain team, you and Nancy, right? You check your street and everything's fine, and you're reporting to the command center, which is down at the church across from Old Mill School, so not too far from you. We are fine. They will then give you directions as to what to do next. And they might simply say, hold on, stay where you are for the next 15 minutes till we check around. Or they might say, could you now go over to Kinga's block and help her out? So they would give you instructions.
Thank you.
Let's talk about these words you hear on the radio. They're called pro words. They don't mean professional. They mean procedural. This comes from NATO radio practice, but we use them all the way down to NRG. These are the main ones you're going to hear, but the ones in color are the ones you really need to care about. The other ones are relatively arcane. But the ones in blue and the ones in orange, red, and green are the important ones. So let me fade out the ones we don't really need that much. Over, Roger, and out. These are the most misunderstood because Hollywood makes a mess of them. Everyone in a Hollywood movie or on television always says Roger, over, and out. I mean, they use them all the time, as if they mean the same thing. They're very specific, as you can see. Over means I finished my sentence. Now it's your turn. That's what over means. Roger means, okay, yes, I heard you. It's very different than over. And out means I'm done. I'm ceding the floor, if you will. Now it's available for someone else, the frequency, the floor, if you will. I'm giving up my my spotlight for a moment. So these all have very specific meanings. I think once you look at them for a moment, it's like, okay, got it. That actually makes sense. So don't let all the things we've seen on movies and TV kind of blur these together as a grab bag, and you could use any of them. They have specific meanings to operators, so please memorize those. Now, on the bottom, it really gets important. The word emergency. I hope you never use it, because if you use the word emergency, you are in the most dire, literal life or death, and nothing lower than that situation. That's all emergency ever means. It doesn't mean a huge gas leak just opened up. It doesn't mean a house is on fire, unless it's also a life and death emergency. An empty house that just exploded in flame is not an emergency, unless someone is nearby and is perhaps going to be gravely injured or killed. Emergency is a very rare word to ever use on the radio, so please know that. Don't use it lightly like, oh, I've got an emergency here, I'm out of water, or I'm out of bandages. That's not an emergency. When people hear emergency who are well-trained, they stop everything. If the word emergency comes over the air at a command trailer, you should hear absolute silence immediately, and no one talks. And the one person who has the radio and the scribe who is with them have the entire floor. So it's a very potent word. Priority is pretty close to it. That means you've got a very urgent, non-life-threatening situation. Let's say a house blows up from a gas explosion. You don't think anyone's in there or immediately nearby, but boy, that's a big deal. That's when you use priority. It's also a very potent word. And finally, break is the one I think you're usually looking for when you want to butt in with something that is important, but not of an urgency. You see, there's a continuum here. It's not a super bright line when you get to break, but the idea that you want to say something that you think needs to be heard and you want to perhaps break in. This is during those 2-second breaks we saw a little while ago. Remember in the flow chart of how we talk, there were those 2-second breaks. You leave those breaks so any of these 3 words in the bottom can come through. So I've hit you with a lot. Let's take a breather now. Sit back and watch a video. This video is not was not done for NRGs or certs. It was done for ham radio operators, but about 85% of it relates to what we're doing in terms of radio practice. You'll hear a couple of unusual terms here. I'll explain those later, but I think this will stand on its own to show you some of this in actual operation. This just takes a few minutes and gives us a chance just to kind of see some of this in action. So let's take a look at that now.
Observing good procedures is essential during public service events or emergencies for 3 reasons.
We can have many operators work together without confusion. We can log all radio traffic at net control and at field stations. And we pass the most information with the least amount of transmissions.
Here are the procedures you will want to practice.
Your first job as a radio operator is to always be listening, so you can immediately respond to a call from net control.
I copy that a rider with an orange vest whereabouts are currently unknown, and all stations please report if seen.
Make sure you're not interrupting. Transmitting at the same time as another station is called doubling, and it's never useful.
We need water at the Tennessee Valley Station and a SAG to work the course backwards from here if one is available.
Notice if you can assist. Sometimes you'll hear information useful to you in an exchange between other stations. That is called receiving by intercept.
The orange vest has arrived at this location, the I-6.
Thank you. SAG 1, did you copy by intercept?
SAG 1, affirmative.
Much good radio practice is done even before you first key up.
Make sure you know what you're going to say before you transmit.
Making it up as you go along after you press the push to talk button typically leads to long, unclear transmissions.
We had a runner come through here about 2 or 3 minutes ago, maybe it was 4, with a yellow shirt and blue shorts. I tried to get a bib number, but I couldn't catch it. Ken, would you see if that runner has a bib?
Keep your transmissions succinct by composing them in your head first.
The first 3 runners through this location are 151, 223, and 106. Over.
Similarly, keep idle chatter to a minimum during a directed net. We're here to get a job done.
A little cordiality adds friendliness to a net, but anything more reduces efficiency.
One of the most common operator errors is going too fast. Pause 1 second after key up to give our simulcast system time to synchronize and not miss the start of your message.
Also pause between each side of a conversation.
Pause 2 seconds to avoid tailgating.
Net control, cardiac.
Cardiac, net control, go ahead.
Leaving these gaps between each side of a conversation allows another station to break in if it has emergency or priority traffic.
Speak at writing pace. One of the key functions of net control is to log all communications. If you speak faster than someone can write, then you will be asked to repeat your transmission, which will waste airtime.
Speak clearly. Enunciate into the mic so that you do not blur your words together.
We like to say every word is an event.
Hold your mic about a hand width away from your mouth.
Don't shout into the microphone, as that can distort your signal. And speak across the microphone to avoid distortion and unintelligibility, especially with letters like B and P.
Radio is an invisible medium, so stations need to make it audibly clear who is speaking. When contacting another station, start with their ID first, followed by yours. Then, wait to be acknowledged by the other station.
Once contact has been established, don't over-ID. It is already understood which stations are communicating.
At the end of your conversation, ID out. That will typically consist of your tactical call sign, followed by your personal call sign.
Nicasio School, Roger, net control, KM6ASI.
And that tells all stations that you're finished and the frequency is open.
One of the most important communication techniques is knowing how and when not to communicate.
When net control tells you to stand by, stop transmitting until net control calls you back.
Your exchange with net control isn't over, it's paused, while net control deals with something more important, which can include something happening off the air at net control.
Group of 7 cyclists just leaving. The last 2, one has an orange vest and the other has a white shirt, black.
Of course, you can always break in with emergency or priority traffic when you're standing by, but any other transmissions may only confuse the situation.
If you need to tell net control to stand by while you gather information or deal with a distraction, tell net control, get back within 15 seconds.
If you need more time than that, tell net control and ID out.
If you hear net control tell another station to stand by, that is not an invitation to break in.
Unless, of course, you have emergency or priority traffic. Otherwise, net control is still engaged with the other station.
These directed net practices allow many operators to exchange a lot of information during an event or emergency.
They also create a professional decorum which reflects the important work that we do.
Thank you for your time and effort to make these practices yours.
Okay, so I know there was a little bit of different jargon there, and the scenario was very much based on a bike race or a hike, which is a lot of what the Ham Radio Club uses for drills. But I think about 85% of that, you could see some of the rhythm and some of the themes. Doesn't matter what you're doing on the radio, a lot of the practices are the same. I want to call out the advice that was given about holding your microphone in a certain position. By this, we mean our radio in NRG terms. So you want to keep that radio not right up against your lips, like a rock singer always seems to do with a microphone, but a couple inches away and slightly bladed away from your mouth. So slightly sideways. So you're speaking across the microphone. That'll prevent you from creating pops from B's and P's that can distort. A license is technically required to use the radios that we use, the GMRS radio. The license, that's what it looks like. It's a piece of paper. There's no test, so everyone can relax. No one has to run out of the room. They're not going to make you learn Morse code. No one has to learn that anymore, not even the ham operators. And it's very much just an attestation that you will follow the rules, not a test that you've learned certain skills. We are teaching you those now. The no test, you just have to be 18 years old to get a license. There's an $85 fee currently. It moves around from time to time, but it's good for 10 years. So already we're at $8.50 a year. So that makes it a little more digestible. I realize it's a relatively stout amount, but it lasts a long time. But another thing which helps is that it also allows anyone in your family, and it's a very broad definition of family, by the way. So that also sort of brings down the effective cost. You will get a call sign. Some folks think that's pretty cool. I'm WQYC 733, for example. We don't use these call signs for NRG, as you've probably noticed. I've not mentioned them. You saw in the video, the ham operators use their call signs a lot. That's a different sort of an application, but we don't use them for NRG. But for what it's worth, you'll get an interesting little call sign like that, and that's yours and no one else's, but you're not having to use it in NRG use. And you can't use these for business. GMRS radios are not allowed to be used for, let's say, if you have a catering business and you want to be able to talk to your folks as they're out delivering food. That's technically not legal. There's another class of radios that are used for that. Some of this is pretty arcane, and you might look at it and say, well, this is silly. Do I need to have a license? I mean, I'm just using the radio. We always advocate doing it the right way, following the rules, because we are a public service organization. We do want to make sure we set a good example if it ever comes up in conversation or otherwise. And we're part of a continuum of organizations, NRG, CERT, ACS RACES, which is ham operators, all the way on up to professional first responders. We are part of that continuum in a loose sense. And we want to make sure we're not bringing any kind of sloppy behaviors into that pool. So we do encourage you to get the GMRS license. Let's talk about range. We get a lot of questions. How far do these things reach, and why can't I talk as far as it says on the package? If you bought these, you probably saw what you see in the red box there when you bought the container. 36-mile range. That's amazing. That's great. Why do I have a cell phone? Why don't I just buy all my friends one of these inexpensive radios? We'll have our own private network. 36 miles is incredible. Well, as you probably know, we don't get 36 miles out of these. Almost nowhere do you get 36 miles unless you're in a perfectly still, open part of the plains in North Dakota. This doesn't work that way in the Bay Area. So let's talk about the reality. Here's the best range you'll get. When you're up high and you have nothing in the way. From that hill in Tiburon, that's Ring Mountain, I guess, I can talk to Berkeley. That's pretty good range. And probably even further. But this is rare. You're up high with line of sight. Two key things. This is not very commonly going to happen in NRG work. More common is like this. You'll be in a neighborhood. Maybe you're on a slight rise. This is in front of Cove School over in Mariner Cove. You're maybe 10 feet above average terrain because the road kind of rises there. All the homes are relatively low homes, and they're made of wood, not glass and cement. There's not a lot of big structures. So you're going to be able to reach a lot of area here. You can reach that hill. You can reach about 400 homes in that area, which covers all of Mariner Cove and a big subdivision. So that's great. This is a very common scenario in certain parts of Marin. Now, here's where you might be in an area where you're congregating in a school or a community center, and now you've got more challenges. You've got a lot of built-up buildings nearby, 2 stories, metal, glass, stucco. Stucco is your enemy. Stucco is full of wire, and the wire in stucco is almost the perfect way to block radio signals. It's like the CIA couldn't invent anything better. So know that when you're near stucco walls, you're near a huge obstruction, and whatever is on the other side of that wall may not be able to hear you. Not very well. So always be aware of stucco walls. Be much more friendly around wooden buildings and not around stucco, metal, glass, and much more big commercial sort of synthetic structure buildings. They tend to be a bigger problem. So this is starting to get compromised here. And here's your toughest one. And you see a lot of this around Mill Valley, Tam Valley. You're in one valley and you're trying to reach someone in another one. And it's just right around the horn. And yet you've got a huge mound of wet soil between you and them. And soil is full of minerals, and radio signals don't like it. So know that just because you're nearby, if you're nearby in the next little mini canyon, you're a long way away in many cases. And this is why we spend so much time working with you on where everyone is located, where command is set up, and what channel you're going to be on. And that's what we're always working to refine, to make sure command is not in the other valley from you, but is, let's say, down on the left, where both valleys can see command. So that's part of why we're always working on locations and channels, just FYI. A couple last thoughts for you. When you hold the radio, when you see on TV, they always hold it this way because it looks good, kind of at a cocky angle. This is not how you want to hold the radio. The antenna is almost flat, right? That's how they always do in the cop shows. What you want to do is not hold the radio that way. You want to hold the radio straight up and down. That's how radios are meant to transmit. They send out a signal that is essentially a big invisible donut or a bagel that is sitting on the antenna. The antenna is going through the hole of the bagel, if you think of it that way. And the bagel is, a mile or two across. That's a radio signal. So you want to make sure you're sending the signal out like a big bagel or a big life preserver, as opposed to holding the radio sideways. You're sending some of the signal into the pavement and some of the signal to the space station, and very little of it is going out. So always hold your radio straight up and down. Resist the urge to put it at a cocky angle. Talk across the microphone. We talked about that already. And keep your body out of the way. So in other words, face who you're trying to talk to, not put your back to who you're trying to talk to. If your body's in the way, your body's a big old wet bag of minerals also, and it also wants to block radio signals. So face who you're trying to reach. Very simple thing to remember. Troubleshooting the main things. Are you on the right channel if you're not reaching anyone? Do you have the right subchannel if you use them? Is your volume turned up? I can't tell many folks have their volume turned down and don't realize that's why they're not hearing anybody. Do you have fresh batteries? We don't use rechargeables, and we don't try and run batteries down. We actually use fresh batteries off the shelf that are not rechargeable, and we change them frequently because these radios do not have very accurate charge indicators on the screen. It's like your cell phone. It says 4 bars and you can't get through. It's a very rough approximation. Don't look at your power indicator on your radio and say, oh, I've got 3 bars. I'm still good for a couple of hours. Once you're down below all the bars, and I forget how many there are, time for new batteries. Don't be stingy with these. There's a time to be very good about recycling and using rechargeables. This is not the time. So we don't use rechargeable packs, even though your radio comes with one. Put it away. Do not use it for NRG use. Do not use rechargeable batteries. They have less voltage, and they tend not to last as well in the kind of usage we do. Use standard alkaline batteries and always store them like this, all pointing the same way. It actually makes a difference.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
So you talked about the block captains as co-captains and coordinating the use of the radio when one has to take a break or something like that. Would there ever be a scenario, and this is more procedural and logistics, where you might divide and conquer because you wanted to search more homes? Would you ever have a scenario in which you would talk to your co-captain on the radio on a different channel? How do you handle something like that?
So if I can, Brian, if you're okay, if I step in.
Absolutely.
So we really encourage, it's like we encourage our block captains like CERTs to work as a team. So we don't want you going off one, going down Evelyn, where Karen's not able to see where you are. There's no line of sight. And suddenly she doesn't know where you are. There's no message. Now she has to drop what she's doing and come after you. So we really encourage everybody to stay together. Now, what we're doing at this point, because we're doing the funding game with NRGs, is we're trying to get at least one radio for every team of block captains, because you really only need one of you to be reporting. So that's kind of where we are at this point. But you might have one radio that doesn't work. So you use your co-block captain's radio because that one is working. Or suddenly you find your batteries are dead, but your co-captains work fine. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Yeah.
I have a question about how many handsets can be on one license. Is it one license per handset?
No, it's any number of radios per that license. So everyone can have their own radio on that same license as long as they're part of your general family. And I forget the definition, but as I mentioned, the family is defined very broadly by the FCC. So you're very good. No one's going to come knock on your door and ask, do you have a GMRS license? Let's be honest here. Okay. So we're not talking about that kind of a thing. But
it could be every block captain in our territory.
Yeah, every block captain in the territory, when they have a license, their entire family can use a radio. Yeah,
Right.
but they can't have other block captains jump on because they're not part of the same family, unless they happen to be 2 block captains who happen to live down the road from each other and are both the same family. I guess that could happen.
I get it. Yeah.
Sorry if I missed this. The radios, is that something the block captain should purchase themselves? Is that something that's provided by the NRGs?
Right. So we have a certain number of, we received the NRGs in Mill Valley had great aspirations to ask the city for some support, and then COVID hit. So of course our city and unincorporated areas are basically not able to provide any funding. We did receive a wonderful but small grant from the Outdoor Art Club. That's almost all gone. So we have a few radios to share. Now, what we are in the process of doing is working with Southern Marin Fire Department for a 501c3 fiduciary agent so that we can ask for some donations. Most of the supplies of our block captains are not expensive. For example, it's a clipboard, a vest, which is about $10, and the radio for a pair is only $69. So this is not a huge investment. And if people want to decide to order their own, we have some block captains who are doing that versus waiting until the funding, because we've written a grant. We're going to write another grant. We're waiting for larger donate. It's that kind of thing. That's the funding game. But if people want to, we can certainly send out. It'll be on the website. Let's do that. We're going to put it on the website about the recommendation of the radio. And if people want to order their own, that is totally fine.
Yeah. And then I put in the chat my question about the intercept of, like, if my radio doesn't work, we're always listening. Everyone's listening. Med hears, intercepts it, talks to control. I'm still listening, but does control call me to say that they've heard it and something's on their way, or do I just assume?
Med is going to do intercept in both directions. So they're going to become the intermediary. So they will relay your message in, and when they hear it back, they're going to relay it back. If you're talking about relay, that's when you're unable to reach control.
Yes, when I'm unable and they
That's called relay.
Oh,
Yeah,
relay, sorry.
That's relay. Yeah, intercept is when you happen to hear something going on that also applies to you.
Relay.
But on relay, yeah, Med needs to step in. Once they do, in that scenario, they need to stay involved because you're not going to hear the reply. So they have to relay that to you. And then your reply, they're going to hear, and they're going to relay that back. So they're going to be in the middle of this ping pong game until the conversation's over. So that's a good question.
All right, thanks.
I know we've hit you with a lot of stuff, so know that this gets dramatically easier with a few drills.